For years, my son mocked me. He sat at the head of my dining table in the mansion I built and told his wealthy in-laws I was hiding something about my past. At Thanksgiving dinner, he slid a small cardboard box across the polished wood. It was a DNA test kit. "Let us see who you really are, old man," he sneered. "Or if you are just a fraud." The whole table erupted in laughter. I did not yell. I did not throw them out. I simply opened the box and took the test right there. Weeks later, when the results came back, I placed them next to the Christmas turkey and waited for him to read the first line. He stopped smiling forever. Because the results did not expose my past. They exposed his. My name is Leroy Sterling, but everyone calls me Roy. I am 74 years old, and I spent 50 years building an empire from the absolute dirt of Atlanta. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed the entitled parasite sitting at my dining table, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and betrayal should always be paid back in full. The smell of roasted turkey and expensive sage stuffing filled the air of my dining room, but the atmosphere was entirely toxic. It was Thanksgiving evening. I was sitting at the far end of the massive mahogany table in my own house. The house I paid for in cash. But if you looked at the seating arrangement, you would think I was just an unwanted guest. My son Julian and his wife Victoria had positioned themselves at the center, taking over the host duties as if I were already dead and buried. Victoria was a woman who practically breathed entitlement. She came from a family of old money pretenders, and she never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of her high society pedigree. Her parents, Richard and Susan, were sitting across from me, sipping my vintage wine and looking around my home with a mixture of quiet jealousy and blatant condescension. They were the kind of people who smiled to your face while checking your pockets. Julian, my son, was soaking up their approval like a sponge. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than my first delivery truck. 3 years ago, I had handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Freight. I stepped down thinking I had raised a strong, capable man ready to lead the logistics empire I had built from absolutely nothing. I thought he understood the value of the legacy. I was completely wrong. He was just playing a role, and his favorite audience was his arrogant white in-laws. The dinner conversation was a masterclass in subtle disrespect. Susan leaned forward, resting her diamond rings on the table. "You know, Roy," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "your home is surprisingly tasteful. I must admit I did not expect such refined architecture from someone with your rough background. It is so fascinating how you managed to pull yourself out of those dreadful slums." I took a slow sip of my water. "I did not pull myself out, Susan," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "I worked my way out. One 16-hour shift at a time." Richard chuckled, letting out a patronizing sigh. "Hard work is commendable, Roy. But let us be honest. A lot of it is just luck. Being in the right place at the right time. Julian here has the real business acumen. He is the one taking the company global." I looked at Julian, waiting for him to correct his father-in-law. I waited for him to mention that Sterling Freight was already a national powerhouse long before I handed him the keys. I waited for the son I raised to defend his father. But Julian just smiled and raised his wine glass in agreement. "You are right, Richard," Julian said, puffing out his chest. "The old methods were good for the old days. But the modern market requires sophisticated blood. You need a certain pedigree to navigate international waters." Pedigree! The word hung in the air like a foul odor. Julian loved using words like that lately. He loved pretending he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, conveniently forgetting the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where his mother Sylvia and I raised him. He forgot the nights I came home covered in motor oil and diesel fuel so he could wear nice clothes to his expensive private school. Victoria placed her hand on Julian's arm, gazing at him with an expression of pure superiority. "That is exactly why we were talking about ancestry the other day," she announced loud enough for the whole room to stop eating. "We were tracing my family tree back to Europe, and Julian realized he does not really know anything about his roots." Julian leaned forward, a malicious smirk spreading across his face. "That is true," he said, locking his eyes on me. "You never talk about your family, Dad. You never talk about your parents or where you really come from. It is almost like you are hiding something or avoiding someone." The table grew quiet. The table grew. The tension was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. "I have nothing to hide, Julian," I said, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. My parents were poor, hard-working people who died when I was young. There is no grand mystery, just survival. Julian let out a loud, mocking laugh. Survival. Right. Well, Victoria and I decided it is time to bring some transparency into this family. We think it is time to find out exactly what kind of blood is running through our veins. He reached under his chair and pulled out a small rectangular cardboard box. He tossed it casually across the polished mahogany table. It slid and stopped right next to my dinner plate. I looked down at the bright blue and white packaging. It was a commercial DNA testing kit. Go ahead, old man. Julian sneered, his voice completely stripped of any filial respect. Let us see who you really are. Let us see if you are really the proud, self-made patriarch you claim to be, or if you are just a fraud hiding a dirty past. Maybe we will find out you are related to some common criminals. Victoria let out a sharp, cruel giggle. Richard and Susan joined in chuckling into their wine glasses. They were all sitting in my house, drinking my wine, eating the food my money paid for, and laughing at my expense. Julian was treating me like a court jester to entertain his racist in-laws. I looked at the DNA kit, and then I looked at the boy I had loved for 40 years. I remembered his mother, Sylvia. She passed away 10 years ago, taking a massive secret to her grave. A secret she thought I never knew. But I knew. I knew from the very beginning that Sylvia had an affair. I knew that the child she brought into my home did not share a single drop of my blood. But I made a choice. I chose to be a father. I chose to love him, to raise him, to protect him from a world that would tear him apart. I gave him my name, my protection, and eventually my entire empire. And this was my repayment. Public humiliation. The laughter around the table died down as they waited for me to explode. They expected me to throw the box back at him. They expected the angry, aggressive reaction of an old man whose pride was wounded. They wanted a show. I did not give them one. I slowly picked up the box. I broke the plastic seal with my thumb. The silence in the dining room became absolute. Everyone watched in stunned disbelief as I pulled the sterile cotton swab from its plastic wrapper. I looked directly into Julian's eyes. My gaze was not angry. It was empty, cold, and entirely devoid of the fatherly warmth he had taken for granted his entire life. I opened my mouth and firmly rubbed the cotton swab against the inside of my cheek. I took my time, making sure the sample was perfect. I placed the swab back into the plastic vial, sealed it tightly, and dropped it into the prepaid return envelope. If you want the truth, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying rumble, you will have it. But be very careful what you ask for, because once the dirt is dug up, you cannot put it back in the hole. Julian swallowed hard, his confident smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second, but his arrogance quickly swallowed his hesitation. He scoffed and leaned back in his chair. I am not afraid of the truth, Dad, he said, puffing out his chest. I am a Sterling. I know exactly who I am. I simply nodded and placed the sealed envelope next to my water glass. You are right, Julian, I murmured. You are about to find out exactly who you are. He went back to his dinner, laughing with Victoria and pouring more wine for his in-laws, completely blind to the trap he had just set for himself. He thought he was humiliating an old man to score points with a family that secretly despised him. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the very weapon I was going to use to legally, financially, and personally obliterate his entire existence. The countdown had officially started. The glass doors of the executive boardroom at Sterling Freight are 2 inches thick and completely soundproof. I paid for them 30 years ago when this company finally broke $100 million in annual revenue. I built this logistics empire from a single rusty delivery truck driving through the worst neighborhoods in Atlanta, hauling scrap metal and wholesale produce until my hands bled. This morning I pushed those heavy glass doors open and walked into a corporate meeting I was never invited to. The room was packed. The entire board of directors was seated around the massive oval table. At the far end, sitting in my custom leather chair, was my son Julian. He was mid-sentence, pointing a laser pointer at a digital projector screen displaying a series of aggressive, declining line graphs. When the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the entire room froze. The older board members, men who had bled and sweat alongside me for decades, immediately sat up straight, looking deeply uncomfortable. But the younger men, the slick private equity suits Julian had brought in over the last year, simply stared at me with cold calculation. Julian lowered his laser pointer. His face paled for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, plastering on that fake, confident smile he learned in business school. Dad? he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. "We were not expecting you this morning. Since it is the day after Thanksgiving, we assumed you would be resting at home." I did not raise my voice. I did not demand to know why the chairman and founder of the company was left off the email invite for an emergency board meeting. I simply walked slowly to the opposite end of the long table, pulled out a standard guest chair, and sat down. "Do not let me interrupt, Julian," I said, folding my hands, resting them on the polished wood. "I am just here to listen. Go ahead and continue your presentation." Julian cleared his throat, nervously adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. He looked at his new corporate allies for reassurance, then turned back to the digital screen. He clicked to the next slide. The words printed in massive bold letters read, "Strategic Restructuring and Legacy Phase Out." As you all know, Julian continued, his voice growing louder, attempting to project absolute authority. "The logistics market is shifting rapidly. We are competing with automated tech startups and global conglomerates. To survive, Sterling Freight cannot remain anchored to the past. We have to pivot away from outdated legacy mindsets. We have to trim the fat." He was pacing the front of the room now, intentionally refusing to look in my direction. "For too long, this company has been run like a family mom-and-pop shop," Julian declared, his tone dripping with condescension. "We rely on old handshakes and gut feelings. That kind of street-level hustle was fine for the 1980s, but today it is a liability. We need aggressive modern leadership. We need to phase out the aging leadership that is too slow to adapt to international markets." He was publicly mocking me in front of the board I had built. He was calling my 50 years of flawless business execution a street-level hustle. I sat completely motionless at the end of the table, staring at him. 3 years ago, I voluntarily handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer. I did it because I believed he was ready. I wanted him to feel the pride of running the empire. I wanted him to step out of my shadow and cast his own. I had given him the keys to a kingdom with zero debt and thousands of loyal employees. I thought I had raised a lion, but looking at him now, I realized I had raised a parasite. He did not want to lead my company. He wanted to steal it and erase my name from the building. The older board members looked down at their notebooks, unable to meet my eyes out of sheer shame. They knew Julian was orchestrating a quiet corporate coup, but they lacked the spine to stop him. I did not interrupt his insulting speech. I remained perfectly silent, letting him dig his grave deeper with every single word. As he continued to drone on about liquidating our older assets, I noticed a thick manila folder resting on the table right next to my elbow. It belonged to one of Julian's young corporate lawyers who had stepped out to take a phone call, leaving his documents completely exposed. The folder was labeled Confidential Charter Amendments. While Julian was busy boasting about his vision for the future, I quietly flipped the folder open. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. At first glance, it looked like standard corporate restructuring paperwork. Adjustments to executive compensation, changes to vendor contracts, things a CEO might legally propose. But then I flipped to the fourth page and a specific section of text caught my eye. The legal phrasing was highlighted in yellow marker, indicating it was the primary focus of the upcoming board vote. It was an addendum to the Sterling Freight Emergency Corporate Trust. The trust was not just a regular bank account. It was the absolute bedrock of my empire. Decades ago, I had locked away hundreds of millions of dollars in a highly secure financial reserve. It was designed to protect the company from hostile takeovers, economic depressions, or catastrophic losses. It was the ultimate safety net. And as the founder, I was the only person on Earth with the legal authority to activate those funds. I had never given Julian access to that specific vault. I read the highlighted text very carefully. Article 4.2. In the event of the founder's severe cognitive decline or physical incapacitation, full unilateral control of the emergency corporate trust shall immediately transfer to the chief executive officer. That was standard. I had put that clause in there myself years ago to ensure the company survived if I suddenly passed away. But Julian had drafted a new, highly specific sentence right beneath it. Furthermore, the document read to ensure the absolute integrity of the transition and protect the assets from external claims. This transfer of power can only be activated by an heir who can provide verified, certified medical proof of a direct genetic bloodline to the founder. My heart completely stopped in my chest. The air in the boardroom suddenly felt heavy and thin. A direct genetic bloodline. I stared at the words printed on the stark white paper, and suddenly the events of last night crashed over me like a tidal wave. The Thanksgiving dinner, the smug looks from his white in-laws, Victoria sneering at me from across the table, and Julian tossing that commercial DNA testing kit right next to my plate. "Let us see who you really are, old man," he had said, laughing in my face. "Let us see if you are a fraud." It had absolutely nothing to do with ancestry. It was not a cruel joke to entertain Victoria's racist parents. It was a cold, calculated legal maneuver. Julian needed my DNA on record. He needed a certified laboratory document proving that he was my biological son, the direct genetic heir. He was pushing this specific amendment through the board today, and once it was approved, he was going to use the results of that DNA test to legally lock the entire board out of the trust fund. He was setting up a completely impenetrable legal fortress around my deepest pockets, ensuring that he, and only he, could drain the corporate reserves. He was going to use the bloodline clause to seize total control and then use the cognitive decline clause to have me forcefully removed from the board entirely. He thought he was a mastermind playing a flawless game of corporate chess. He thought the DNA test was going to come back showing a 99.9% genetic match. He thought he was pure sterling blood securing his absolute right to the throne. He had no idea that his mother had taken a terrible secret to her grave. He had no idea that the blood running through his veins belonged to a completely different man. He had just hardwired the survival of his corporate coup to a genetic requirement he did not possess. I gently closed the manila folder and slid it exactly back to where it was. I looked up the length of the long boardroom table. Julian was finishing his presentation, looking incredibly smug. He asked if there were any questions from the board. The room was silent. Julian finally looked directly at me, a challenging, arrogant glint in his eye. "Do you have anything to add, Dad?" he asked, his tone openly mocking. "Any old school advice for us before we move to a vote?" I stood up slowly, buttoning the jacket of my tailored suit. I looked at the boy I had loved, the boy I had protected, the boy who was actively trying to ruin me. "No, Julian," I said, my voice low and perfectly calm. "Your presentation was very enlightening. You have everything completely figured out. Proceed with your vote." I turned around and pushed the heavy glass doors open, walking out of the boardroom without looking back. Let him pass his amendments. Let him tighten the noose. He thought he was locking me out of my own empire. He did not realize he had just handed me the legal authority to financially execute him. The trap was set, and he was the one holding the trigger. I walked straight to my private elevator, pulled out my secure cell phone, and dialed my lawyer. It was time to pull the financial records of his precious wife's family. 3 weeks passed since the Thanksgiving dinner. 3 weeks of absolute silence from my end while Julian and Victoria continued to parade around my mansion, acting like the undisputed king and queen of Atlanta. I stayed out of their way. I let them host their lavish cocktail parties. I let them pour my expensive wine for their racist friends. I watched them measure the drapes and discuss how they were going to redecorate the estate once I was finally out of the picture. I sat in my private study and I waited. I knew something they did not know. Patience is the greatest weapon a builder possesses. You cannot rush the pouring of a foundation, and you certainly cannot rush a demolition. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my secure laptop chimed with a notification. I was sitting in my leather armchair staring out at the gray clouds rolling over the city. I clicked open my inbox. There it was. An email from the Commercial Genetics Laboratory. Your DNA test results are ready to view. I set my coffee mug down on the mahogany desk. My hands did not tremble. My heart did not race. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over my entire body. I clicked the secure link and entered the temporary password Julian had so arrogantly set up for me on that holiday night. He had registered the kit under his own master account, probably so he could monitor the results himself and use them as leverage the exact second they were processed. He wanted to catch me in a lie. He wanted to expose my roots. The web page loaded slowly. The first screen displayed a colorful map breaking down my ancestral origins. It showed the expected percentages. Strong ties to West Africa, a lineage of resilient people who survived unimaginable hardships. There were no surprises there. I knew who my ancestors were. I felt their strength in my bones every single time I swung a hammer or negotiated a multi-million-dollar freight contract. I was a proud black man who built an empire from the mud. I did not need a piece of paper to validate my heritage, but I was not looking for my ancestry. I clicked the tab labeled DNA Relatives and Matches. The screen refreshed. Because Julian had purchased the kit and taken the test himself a few months prior to prove his own sophisticated pedigree, his profile was already fully registered in their global database. The algorithm automatically cross-referenced my genetic markers with his. The system was designed to instantly identify family members and build a digital family tree. There, right at the top of the page, was Julian Sterling. It showed his profile picture wearing a smug smile and a tailored suit. And right below his name in stark bold letters was the genetic compatibility score. 0% match, no biological relationship detected. I stared at those words for a long time. The bright glow of the computer screen illuminated the dark wood of my study. 0%. Not a father, not an uncle, not even a distant cousin. We shared absolutely no blood. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the cool leather of my chair. The heavy silence of the room was immediately replaced by the loud echoing ghosts of my past. The memories came flooding back, transporting me 40 years into the past to a cramped two-bedroom apartment in South Atlanta. I remembered Sylvia, my late wife. She was beautiful, ambitious, and deeply unhappy with the poverty we were living in. In those days, I was working 2 grueling jobs just to keep the lights on and put food on the table. I was driving a delivery truck by day and loading warehouse crates by night. I came home exhausted, smelling like diesel exhaust and cheap coffee. I did not have the time or the energy to give her the luxurious life she felt she deserved. I knew when the affair started. The subtle changes in her behavior, the unexplained absences, the perfume that did not belong to her, the emotional distance that grew between us like a thick wall of ice. I knew she was seeing another man, a man who had the money and the status I was desperately trying to build. I knew it all. And when she came to me crying, telling me she was pregnant, I did not scream. I did not throw her out into the street. I looked at her tear-stained face and I made the hardest decision a man could ever make. I chose to swallow my pride. I chose forgiveness. I chose to build a family even if the foundation was cracked. When Julian was born, I held that tiny, fragile baby in my rough, calloused hands. I looked into his eyes, and I made a silent vow. I promised the universe that I would raise him as my own. I would give him my last name. I would protect him from the harsh realities of the world. I would work my fingers to the bone to ensure he never had to feel the sting of poverty. I buried the secret deep inside my soul. I never told Sylvia that I knew the truth. I let her take her guilt to the grave. I loved Julian unconditionally, giving him the entire world on a silver platter. I thought love could override biology. I thought that by giving him everything he would learn the value of loyalty and respect. I opened my eyes and looked back at the glaring 0% on the computer screen. I had been completely wrong. I gave him a kingdom, and it only turned him into an arrogant, entitled tyrant. He had inherited his mother's deceit and the cowardice of a father he never even knew. A low, dark chuckle escaped my lips, echoing strangely in the quiet study. The absolute poetic justice of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. Julian did not know he was a bastard. Sylvia had played her part flawlessly, taking the secret with her when she died 10 years ago. Julian grew up fully believing he was the sole pure-blooded heir to the Sterling logistics empire. He walked around with his chest puffed out, bragging to his racist white in-laws about his elite pedigree. He firmly believed that the blood of a self-made titan coursed through his veins. That was exactly why he had thrown that DNA kit in my face at Thanksgiving. He thought I was hiding some shameful secret about my parents. He thought he was exposing my past. He forced me to take that test because he needed official certified medical documentation to trigger the trap he had set in the corporate boardroom. I remembered the highlighted text in the confidential legal folder I had seen at the company headquarters. Article 4.2. To ensure the absolute integrity of the transition and protect the assets from external claims, this transfer of power can only be activated by an heir who can provide verified, certified medical proof of a direct genetic bloodline to the founder. Julian had written that clause himself. He manipulated the board of directors into passing it. He designed an impenetrable legal fortress around my multi-million-dollar emergency trust fund, thinking he was the only person on Earth with the genetic key to unlock the door. He planned to use this exact DNA result to prove his unquestionable right to the throne, right before he used a fake medical evaluation to have me declared mentally incompetent and removed from the company forever. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought he had completely outsmarted the old, uneducated truck driver. He had no idea that he had just legislated himself completely out of the company. By mandating a strict genetic bloodline clause, he had legally, permanently, and irrevocably severed his own claim to my empire. He handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. I reached out and clicked the print button on my laptop. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the room whirred to life, humming softly as it spit out the crisp white pages of the laboratory report. I picked up the paper, feeling the warmth of the fresh ink. I did not call him. I did not burst into the living room to confront him. A true king does not scream when he has already won the war. He just waits for the enemy to step blindly onto the battlefield. I carefully folded the DNA results and slipped them into a thick manila envelope. I placed the envelope in the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk and locked it with a brass key. Christmas was only a few weeks away. Victoria was already planning a massive, lavish holiday party for her snobby high society friends. They were planning to serve expensive catering and laugh at my expense one more time. They thought the holidays would be the perfect time to celebrate their impending hostile takeover of my life. Let them celebrate, I thought to myself, staring out at the pouring rain. Let them drink their expensive champagne and dream about my money. Let Julian believe he is the undisputed heir to the sterling crown. Because on Christmas night, I am going to place this envelope right next to his dinner plate. And when he reads that 0%, he is going to realize that the trap he spent months digging for me is the exact same grave he will be buried in. I did not waste a single second after locking those DNA results in my heavy oak desk. The following morning, I drove my old truck straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. I completely bypassed the shiny corporate law firms filled with old money partners and legacy names. When you are preparing for a ruthless, bloodless war, you do not hire a polite diplomat. You hire an executioner. For the past 20 years, my personal executioner has been Valerie. Valerie is a 45-year-old black woman who clawed her way to the absolute top of Harvard Law and came right back to Atlanta to build her own untouchable legal empire. She wears razor-sharp tailored suits and possesses a mind that operates like a flawless supercomputer. She is brilliant, unforgiving, and entirely loyal to me because I was the only businessman in the city who handed her a massive multi-million-dollar retainer the exact day she opened her doors. I saw the fire in her eyes back then, the same fire I had when I was hauling scrap metal in the pouring rain. I walked into her expansive corner office overlooking the busy city streets and dropped a thick manila folder right onto her pristine glass desk. It contained the exact copies of the confidential charter amendments I had memorized in the company boardroom. Valerie did not offer me coffee or empty small talk. She knows I despise wasting time. She picked up the papers and began to read, her dark eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with terrifying predatory speed. She stopped at page 4. A slow, dark smile spread across her face, but it was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a great white shark smelling fresh blood in the water. Article 4.2, she read aloud, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet office. The bloodline clause. Roy, your son is playing a very dangerous game of corporate chess, but he is severely underestimating the board. I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite her, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Explain his exact strategy, Valerie, I commanded. I want to hear the precise legal mechanics of how my own boy plans to bury me. Valerie leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, her expression turning deadly serious. It is a calculated two-step execution, she explained flawlessly. Step 1 is this new genetic mandate. By rewriting the charter to require certified medical proof of a direct bloodline to control the emergency trust fund, Julian is trying to legally isolate the deepest cash reserves of Sterling Freight. He wants to ensure that no board member, no outside investor, and no corporate rival can ever touch that money. He firmly believes his DNA is the ultimate unbreakable key. And step 2, I asked, my voice dropping to a low rumble. Step 2 is your total removal, Valerie said, her eyes locking intensely onto mine. Once he solidifies himself as the sole verified genetic heir, he will trigger the cognitive decline protocol. He will manufacture a fake medical report claiming you are suffering from severe dementia or Alzheimer's. He will present it to the board, arguing that your advanced age and failing mental capacity make you a massive liability to the company. Because the new clause gives the verified blood heir emergency authority, he can legally bypass a standard board vote to oust you. He will strip you of your chairmanship, lock you out of the building, and take total unilateral control of the entire empire. I let out a low, bitter laugh that scraped against the back of my throat. He thinks he is a mastermind. He thinks he built an inescapable trap. He has absolutely no idea that the DNA results he is banking on just proved he has 0% of my blood. He just legally locked himself out of the very empire he is trying to steal. Valerie's eyes widened slightly as she processed the sheer magnitude of that revelation. She knew my long history of building this business from the mud, but she did not know the dark secret about Julian's paternity. You let him mandate a strict bloodline clause knowing full well he is not your biological son? She asked, a profound, deep respect bleeding into her tone. I just gave him the rope, Valerie, I replied, staring out at the city skyline. He is the one eagerly tying it around his own neck. Valerie shook her head in sheer disbelief, but then her expression suddenly shifted. The satisfaction completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, deep crease forming between her brows. She turned her attention to her dual computer monitors, typing furiously into the state's commercial real estate and financial registry. Roy, she said, her voice dropping to a serious, urgent register. If Julian is going through all this trouble to secure the emergency trust fund, it means he is desperate for immediate liquid cash. And if he is desperate for cash, he might not be waiting for the board to approve this specific amendment. He might already be making catastrophic moves. She hit the enter key hard, and a massive digital document loaded onto her bright screen. I stood up and walked around the desk to look over her shoulder. What is it? I demanded, feeling a sudden freezing knot form in the pit of my stomach. Valerie pointed a manicured finger to 3 separate commercial property listings. It is your primary distribution hubs, she said, her voice tight with tension. The 3 largest logistics warehouses Sterling Freight owns, the ones in Savannah, Charlotte, and Jacksonville. The prime properties you paid off completely in cash over a decade ago. What about them? I asked, my voice dangerously low. Julian leveraged them, Valerie stated plainly, pulling up the heavily redacted financial filings. 3 weeks ago, right around the exact time he handed you that DNA test at Thanksgiving dinner, he quietly initiated a massive commercial mortgage against those 3 specific properties. Because he is currently the acting chief executive officer and you gave him operational authority years ago, he was legally able to sign the collateral agreements without raising immediate red flags. I stared at the glowing screen, my large calloused hands clenching into tight, heavy fists. How much did he take out, Valerie? How much debt did my son just anchor to my entire life's work? $15 million, she answered, her voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. He took out a high-interest short-term commercial loan for $15 million in liquid cash. The air was violently sucked out of the room. $15 million. Julian had taken the absolute crown jewels of my logistics network, the massive warehouses that processed 60% of our daily freight across the East Coast, and mortgaged them to the hilt. If that massive loan defaulted, the bank would immediately seize the properties. My entire supply chain would collapse overnight. Thousands of my hard-working employees would lose their jobs. The company I built from a single rusty truck would be completely decimated. He did not invest it back into the company, I said, my mind racing through the severe financial implications. Our quarterly reports showed 0 infrastructure expansion. We have not purchased any new delivery fleets. We have not hired any new executive talent. That money never went into Sterling Freight. Valerie nodded rapidly, her fingers flying across the keyboard to trace the complex electronic wire transfers. No, it did not, she confirmed, tracing a digital line on the monitor. The massive loan was approved and the funds were dispersed directly to the primary corporate account, but they did not stay there for more than 24 hours. The entire $15 million was systematically wired out through a series of highly complex shell transfers. He deliberately scrambled the transaction history to hide the final destination. I looked back out the window at the sprawling city of Atlanta. The anger I felt was no longer just a slow, quiet burn. It was a blazing, uncontrollable inferno. My fake son was not just trying to steal my throne. He was actively dismantling the castle brick by brick while I was still standing inside it. He was gambling with the livelihoods of thousands of people just to satisfy his own reckless greed. Find it, Valerie. I ordered, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. I do not care how many digital firewalls you have to break through or how many elite forensic accountants you have to hire. Follow every single electronic footprint. I want to know exactly where my $15 million went, and I want to know exactly whose pockets are getting fat off my blood and sweat. Valerie did not blink. She picked up her phone and summoned her lead forensic accountant into the room. For the next 3 hours, I sat in the heavy leather chair watching the most brilliant financial minds in Atlanta dissect my son's massive betrayal. They traced the $15 million through a labyrinth of corporate shell companies, blind trusts, and offshore accounts. Julian had been incredibly careful. He had used the exact same sophisticated financial maneuvers he had learned while sitting by my side in the boardroom. He used my own lessons to rob me blind. But he was not as smart as he thought he was. He left a digital trail, and Valerie was a bloodhound. Roy, Valerie said, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the office. We found the bottom of the rabbit hole. The money did not go to the Cayman Islands. It did not go to a Swiss bank. The entire $15 million was eventually funneled into a domestic holding company registered right here in Georgia. She turned her monitor so I could see the screen. The company was named Prestige Holdings. Who owns it? I asked, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. Valerie tapped a few keys, pulling up the corporate registration documents. The primary shareholders of Prestige Holdings are Richard and Susan, Victoria's parents. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely toxic. I stared at the names on the screen, letting the absolute sickness of the situation wash over me. Victoria's family. The same people who sat at my Thanksgiving table drinking my expensive wine and looking at my home with barely disguised contempt. The same people who whispered about my rough background and openly questioned if I truly belonged in their elite circles. They carried themselves like old money royalty. They bragged about their European vacations, their exclusive country club memberships, and their vast generational wealth. They looked down on me because my skin was black and my hands were rough from decades of manual labor. But it was all a pathetic illusion. Valerie continued pulling up their personal financial histories. They are completely bankrupt, Roy. Richard's real estate investments collapsed 2 years ago. Susan's luxury boutique went under shortly after. Their estate is heavily mortgaged. Their credit cards are maxed out. They have been drowning in debt for years, pretending everything was fine to keep their high society status intact. They needed a massive bailout to avoid losing their home and their memberships, and they used my son to steal it from me. I whispered, the sheer audacity of the theft making my jaw clench tight. Victoria must have convinced Julian to do it. Valerie explained, her eyes dark with disgust. She knew her family was going under. She pushed your son to leverage your warehouses and siphon the cash directly into her parents' failing empire. They took your blood, sweat, and tears to save their fake aristocratic facade. They are living off your money while looking down their noses at you. A cold, dark fury settled deep into my bones. For 40 years, I built sterling freight by waking up before the sun and working until my muscles screamed. I faced discrimination, closed doors, and bankers who laughed in my face. I fought through all of it to build an unbreakable legacy. And these arrogant, entitled parasites thought they could just reach into my pockets and steal $15 million to fund their lavish country club dinners. They thought the old black truck driver was too stupid to notice. What is our next move? Valerie asked, her hands resting on the keyboard, ready to unleash absolute hell. We can freeze Prestige Holdings immediately. We can file federal wire fraud charges before the sun goes down. I stood up and walked over to the massive glass window, looking down at the busy streets of Atlanta. No, I said softly. If we freeze the accounts now, Julian will panic. He will know I am onto him before he finishes digging his own grave. He needs the certified DNA results to trigger his corporate takeover. He is still waiting for the trap to snap shut. Let him believe he is winning. My burner phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Julian. Dad, Victoria's parents are hosting an early Christmas dinner tonight at their estate. We really want you to come by. Also, I have some routine medical paperwork for your company health insurance that needs your signature. See you at 7. I stared at the glowing screen. Routine medical paperwork. He was not even trying to hide his movements anymore. He thought I was completely oblivious. He thought I was a docile old animal ready to be led to the slaughterhouse. They are making their move tonight, I told Valerie, sliding the phone back into my pocket. Julian wants me to sign medical paperwork at his in-laws' house. He is setting the stage for the cognitive decline clause. Valerie stood up, her expression fierce. Do not sign a single thing, Roy. Whatever paper they put in front of you, it is a death warrant for your career. I am not going to sign anything, Valerie, I said, adjusting the cuffs of my suit. But I am going to give them exactly the performance they want to see. I am going to let them put the knife right up to my throat so I can see the true look in their eyes. When I arrived at Richard and Susan's sprawling suburban estate that evening, the driveway was packed with expensive luxury vehicles. The vehicles my $15 million had probably paid for. I walked up to the heavy double doors wearing my old comfortable cardigan and slacks, deliberately looking older and softer than I actually was. Victoria opened the door wearing a stunning emerald green designer dress. Her smile was incredibly tight and her eyes were completely devoid of warmth. Roy, she said, her tone falsely sweet. Come in. Julian is waiting for you in the back study. We thought it would be best to get the boring paperwork out of the way before we enjoy our holiday dinner. She did not invite me into the main living room to greet her parents. She did not offer me a drink. She led me straight down a long, carpeted hallway toward a closed mahogany door. She opened it and stepped inside, motioning for me to follow. The study was dimly lit. Julian was sitting behind a large antique wooden desk, looking incredibly nervous. He had a thick stack of legal documents resting in front of him, alongside a fancy silver pen. When I walked in, he stood up quickly, offering a tight, strained smile. Hey, Dad, Julian said, gesturing to the heavy leather chair across from the desk. Have a seat. This will only take a minute. Just some insurance updates the board requires for senior executives. I sat down slowly, letting my hands tremble just a little bit. I let my shoulders slump forward, looking like a tired, confused old man. I looked at the papers on the desk. They were not insurance updates. Even without my reading glasses, I could see the bold heading at the top of the page. Voluntary Declaration of Cognitive Impairment and Transfer of Authority. Julian pushed the papers toward me. Just sign at the bottom line, Dad, he said, his voice slightly unsteady. It just says that if you ever get sick or forgetful, I can handle the business for you. It is to protect the company. I stared at the document, playing my part perfectly. Julian I mumbled, my voice wavering. What is this? Why does it say cognitive impairment? I am not losing my mind, son. Why do I need to sign this tonight? Victoria slammed the study door shut behind us, locking it with a sharp, loud click. The false sweetness completely vanished from her face. She walked over to the desk and slammed her hands down hard on the polished wood, leaning over me like a predator. Because you are losing your mind, Roy, she snapped, her voice dropping the polite filter completely. You are 74 years old. You are slowing down. You are making bad decisions. And quite frankly, the board is embarrassed by you. I looked up at her, feigning absolute shock. Victoria, what are you saying? I am saying it is time for you to step aside, old man, she spat, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated malice. You had a good run, you drove your little delivery trucks, and you got lucky. But Sterling Freight is a global enterprise now. It requires sophisticated leadership. It requires Julian. Your money and your assets belong under the control of people who actually have the pedigree and the education to manage them properly, not some uncultured laborer who stumbled into wealth. I looked at Julian, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to tell his racist, entitled wife to shut her mouth. But Julian just looked down at the desk, unable to meet my eyes. He was completely complicit. He had sold me out for her approval. Just sign the paper, Dad, Julian muttered softly. It will make everything easier. You can just retire and live quietly. You do not have to worry about the business anymore. They were trapping me in a room, insulting my entire existence and demanding I hand over the keys to my kingdom. They thought they had backed a weak, fragile old man into a corner. They thought I would break under the pressure of Victoria's aggressive humiliation. I slowly reached into the pocket of my cardigan. My fingers brushed against my vintage gold pocket watch. It was not just a timepiece. It was a high-grade digital recording device Valerie had given me before I left her office. I quietly pressed the tiny button on the side, feeling it click into place. The device was now capturing every single venomous word Victoria was spitting at me. You think because you built this company you get to dictate its future? Victoria sneered, pacing behind the desk. You do not belong in our world, Roy. You never did. You are an embarrassment to Julian when he has to introduce you to real investors. Sign the document. Transfer your voting rights to your son and go live in a nursing home where you belong. I kept my head lowered, letting my hands shake violently. I took a deep, ragged breath, making myself sound completely overwhelmed and broken. "This is a lot," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I did not know you felt this way, Julian. I did not know I was an embarrassment to you." Julian finally looked up, his face pale. "Dad, it is not like that. We just want what is best for the corporate legacy. I need time," I whimpered slowly, standing up from the leather chair, acting as if my knees could barely support my weight. "I cannot sign this tonight. My hands are shaking too much. Please, let me think about it. Let me read it over." Victoria rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated, aggressive sigh. "You do not need to read it, you old fool. You just need to sign it." "Give him a minute, Victoria," Julian interrupted, his voice tight with anxiety. "He is overwhelmed. We do not want him having a heart attack in your parents' study." I looked at Julian with tear-filled eyes, delivering an Oscar-worthy performance of a shattered father. "Just give me until Christmas Eve," I pleaded softly. "Let me have the holidays." "On Christmas Eve, I will give you everything you want, Julian, I promise. Just let me have a few more weeks to process this." Julian looked at Victoria. She crossed her arms, her jaw clenched tight, but she slowly nodded. She thought she had already won. She thought she had broken my spirit entirely, and the signature was just a formality. "Fine," Victoria said coldly, stepping away from the desk. "Christmas Eve. We are hosting the main holiday dinner at your mansion anyway. You will sign the transfer papers before dessert is served. And if you refuse, we will bring in our own doctors to declare you legally insane. Enjoy your turkey, Roy. It will be your last one as a free man." They unlocked the door and let me walk out of the study. I shuffled slowly down the hallway, keeping my head down, playing the defeated victim. I heard them laughing softly behind closed doors, celebrating their brilliant victory. They thought they had successfully executed a bloodless coup. I walked out the front doors and stepped into the cool night air. The moment the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the trembling stopped completely. My posture straightened. The fragile old man vanished into the dark, leaving only the furious, calculating architect behind. I reached into my pocket and turned off the recording device. I had her. I had Victoria on tape admitting to a conspiracy to strip me of my assets. I had Julian acting as an accomplice to elder abuse. And best of all, I had bought myself exactly the time I needed to execute the most devastating financial massacre Atlanta had ever seen. I pulled out my phone and dialed Valerie. "Did they take the bait?" she asked, her voice sharp and ready. "They swallowed the hook, the line, and the entire fishing rod, Valerie." I said, my voice low and completely devoid of mercy. "They gave me until Christmas Eve to sign my life away." "Perfect," Valerie said. "That gives us exactly enough time to burn their empire to the ground." I looked back at the sprawling estate bought and paid for with my stolen $15 million. "Valerie, I want you to open my personal private fund, the one the company does not know about. I want you to go to Wall Street tomorrow morning and buy up every single outstanding debt Richard and Susan owe. Buy their mortgages, buy their corporate loans, buy their credit debt. I want to own their entire miserable existence." "Consider it done, Roy," she replied. I hung up the phone and walked to my truck. They wanted to ruin my life on Christmas Eve. They were going to learn very quickly that the only gift waiting for them under the tree was their absolute total destruction. I drove my truck straight from that sickening suburban estate into the heart of downtown Atlanta. The night was freezing cold, but the blood in my veins was burning with a quiet, absolute fury. I did not go back to my mansion to sleep. I went directly to the towering glass building where my attorney Valerie kept her office. She knew I was coming. The lights on the top floor were still blazing at midnight. I walked into her office and dropped the vintage gold pocket watch onto her pristine glass desk. I did not say a word. I just sat down in the heavy leather chair and waited. Valerie picked up the watch, pressed the playback button, and listened. The room was perfectly silent except for the high-definition audio recording of Victoria and Julian trapping me in that study. Valerie listened as Victoria called me an uncultured laborer. She listened as my daughter-in-law demanded I surrender my empire and go live in a nursing home where I belonged. She listened as Julian, my own son, stood by like a coward and told me it was what was best for his corporate legacy. When the recording clicked off, Valerie looked up at me. Her dark eyes were completely void of any professional politeness. They were the eyes of an executioner ready to receive the final order. "They gave you until Christmas Eve. Valerie said, her voice dangerously calm. They really believe they have you backed into a corner. They think you are terrified. I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on my knees. Julian thinks Sterling Freight is the only thing I have ever built, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. He thinks because I gave him the CEO title to the logistics company that he holds the keys to my entire kingdom. He never understood that when you haul freight across the country for 40 years, you learn about a lot more than just trucks. You learn about real estate. You learn about land acquisitions. You learn how money moves in the shadows. Valerie smiled a slow, predatory smile. She knew exactly what I was talking about. For 40 years, I took 40% of my personal profits and buried them. I continued explaining the reality that my arrogant son was completely blind to. I built anonymous offshore holding companies. I bought commercial real estate through proxy corporations. I established a private equity fund that completely dwarfs the corporate treasury of Sterling Freight. Julian does not even know those account numbers exist. He thinks I am just an old truck driver who got lucky. It is time to show him what a real titan looks like. I looked Valerie directly in the eyes. Open the Vanguard account, I commanded. We are going shopping on Wall Street tonight. Valerie did not hesitate. Her fingers began to fly across her keyboard, unlocking the encrypted financial portals that held my true net worth. We already know that Richard and Susan are drowning in debt, she said, pulling up the heavily redacted files on Victoria's parents. We know their shipping company is functionally bankrupt and their personal estate is leveraged to the absolute limit. What exactly do you want to buy, Roy? I want all of it, I told her, leaning back in the chair. I want the mortgage on their sprawling suburban mansion. I want the mezzanine loans holding up their failing corporate shell. I want the high interest lines of credit they are using to keep up their fake high society lifestyle. I want to own every single penny they owe to the world. Valerie paused for a fraction of a second, processing the sheer magnitude of the aggressive financial maneuver I was demanding. Purchasing toxic debt from major investment banks is usually a long, tedious process involving weeks of negotiations. But I was not looking for a negotiation. Banks do not care about loyalty, Valerie, I reminded her. They care about liquidity. When an anonymous private equity firm offers to buy toxic high-risk debt in pure cash at 20 cents over the dollar, they do not ask questions. They just sign the transfer papers. Offer them a premium they cannot refuse. Use my personal discretionary fund. I do not care what it costs. Just get it done before the sun comes up. Consider it done, Roy, Valerie said, her voice fully engaged in the warpath. I will have my financial team wake up the managing partners at the equity firms right now. For the next 48 hours, I sat in my private penthouse coordinating the most devastating financial massacre Atlanta had ever seen. I watched as Valerie and her team executed the trades. It was a beautiful, ruthless symphony of corporate power. Wall Street bankers eager to offload bad debt gladly took my anonymous cash. They electronically transferred the promissory notes, the property deeds, and the corporate liens directly into my private holding company. Richard and Susan were completely oblivious. They were likely sitting in their country club, sipping expensive wine, bragging to their racist friends about how their daughter was about to officially inherit a massive logistics empire. They had absolutely no idea that while they were drinking, the very ground they were standing on was being sold out from under them. By Thursday afternoon, my secure laptop chimed with a final notification. I opened the encrypted file from Valerie. The transfer was complete. I stared at the screen, letting the absolute reality of the situation sink deep into my bones. In less than 2 days, I had legally acquired over $30 million of Richard and Susan's debt. I was no longer just the old black father-in-law they openly despised. I was their supreme creditor. I owned the company they pretended was successful. I owned the luxury cars they drove. I owned the massive estate where they hosted their arrogant parties. If they missed a single monthly payment by even 1 minute, I had the absolute legal right to foreclose on their homes, seize their vehicles, and freeze every bank account they possessed. They were breathing my air, sleeping under my roof, and living on my dime. They just did not know it yet. My burner phone suddenly buzzed on the desk. It was an email notification. I opened it and saw a digital invitation wrapped in a sickeningly festive holiday graphic. It was from Victoria. You are cordially invited to the Sterling family Christmas Eve gala. The invitation read, please arrive promptly at 7 o'clock for holiday cocktails. A private family meeting will follow before dinner is served. A private family meeting. That was her polite code word for my execution. That was the exact moment they planned to drag me into a back room, force a pen into my hand, and make me sign away my sanity and my company. They were so confident, they were so blinded by their own greed and unearned sense of superiority that they could not see the massive shadow looming over them. I closed the laptop and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the city below. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was locked and loaded. Now there was nothing left to do but wait. Julian and Victoria were busy ordering expensive catering and buying luxurious decorations for their grand Christmas Eve party. They thought they were preparing for a coronation. They thought they were about to be crowned the new king and queen of the Sterling Empire. They had absolutely no idea they were paying for their own funeral. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon and looked at the calendar on the wall. The red circle around December 24th seemed to glow in the dim light of the room. They wanted the truth. They wanted to expose my past. They wanted to force me out into the cold. I raised my glass to the empty room, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Enjoy your holiday preparations, Julian," I whispered to the silence. "Because Christmas Eve is going to be a night you will never, ever forget." The winter air in Atlanta was bitter cold on Christmas Eve. A light frost was beginning to settle over the massive iron gates of my estate. I pulled my old, reliable truck up to the curb, a safe distance away from the long line of valet-parked luxury vehicles. My house was illuminated like a palace. Bright holiday lights wrapped around the massive oak trees, and the sounds of a live jazz band spilled out into the freezing night. It was a picture-perfect high society holiday gala, and it was all paid for by the blood running through my veins. I sat in the truck for a moment looking at the glowing windows. Then I glanced at my rearview mirror. Parked exactly 50 feet behind me was a completely black, unmarked police cruiser. Inside that car sat Sheriff Thomas Hayes. Thomas and I went way back. Before he wore a badge and before I wore a tailored suit, we were just two young black men trying to survive the harsh streets of this city. I had called him earlier that morning and laid out every single piece of evidence Valerie and I had gathered. I did not ask him for a favor. I presented him with a massive multi-million-dollar federal fraud case. Thomas was just sitting there in the dark engine running, drinking a black coffee, waiting for my text message. Tonight he was not just a sheriff, he was the Grim Reaper, waiting for his cue. I stepped out of the truck. I was not wearing my custom-tailored suits tonight. I chose something far more deliberate. I wore an old faded brown corduroy jacket, scuffed leather work boots, and a pair of simple gray trousers. It was the exact same outfit I used to wear 40 years ago when I was unloading heavy wooden pallets in the freezing rain to feed my family. I wanted them to see the laborer. I wanted them to feel superior. I wanted their arrogance to reach its absolute peak before I brought the ceiling crashing down on their heads. I walked up the long driveway and pushed open the heavy front doors of my own home. The grand foyer was packed with the Atlanta elite. Hedge fund managers, local politicians, and old money socialites holding crystal champagne flutes were laughing and celebrating. The moment my heavy work boots stepped onto the imported marble floor, the laughter nearest to the door began to die down. People turned and stared at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. They looked at me as if a stray dog had just wandered into a five-star restaurant. Standing by the massive decorated Christmas tree in the center of the room was Victoria. She was wearing a stunning red silk gown draped in expensive jewelry that I had inadvertently paid for. She was laughing loudly with her arrogant parents Richard and Susan holding court like she was the undisputed queen of the castle. Then she saw me. The fake holiday cheer vanished from Victoria's face in a fraction of a second. Her eyes widened with absolute fury. She slammed her champagne glass down onto a silver tray and marched directly toward me, her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. The surrounding guests parted to make way for her, watching the spectacle with greedy, judgmental eyes. Julian, my fake son, followed close behind her, looking incredibly nervous but entirely complicit. "What do you think you are doing?" Victoria hissed, her voice a venomous whisper loud enough for the entire front of the room to hear. "Look at you. You look like a homeless vagrant. My parents are here. The city council is here. You are completely humiliating us." I looked at her calmly, keeping my posture relaxed. "You invited me, Victoria," I replied, my voice low and steady. "You sent a message saying we were going to have a private family meeting tonight. She crossed her arms, her face turning a deep shade of red. Yes, to sign the medical transfer papers in the back study, she snapped. I told Julian to bring you through the side entrance. I did not invite you to parade your dirty clothes through my main foyer in front of my prestigious guests. Your main foyer? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She stepped closer, pointing her manicured finger right at my chest. Get out of here right now, she snarled with absolute disdain. I did not invite you to this party. You are losing your mind, Roy. You are sick, and you are a massive embarrassment. Walk out that door and go wait in your truck until I am ready to deal with you. If you refuse, I will have the security guards drag you out and I will sign the involuntary commitment papers tomorrow morning without your consent. I looked past her and locked eyes with Julian. He was standing there in his expensive tuxedo watching his wife treat his father like garbage. Dad, just go wait outside, he muttered, looking down at his shoes. You are making a scene. Just wait in the truck and we will bring the papers out to you later. The sheer, utter cowardice of his words hung in the air. The white elite guests standing nearby were whispering to each other, shaking their heads in pity for the poor, successful couple having to deal with such a difficult, senile old man. Victoria stood there with a triumphant smirk on her face, completely convinced that she had just established her absolute dominance. She thought she had broken my spirit in front of the entire city. I did not yell. I did not raise my hands. I simply nodded slowly, mimicking the posture of a defeated, broken man. I turned around and took 3 slow, heavy steps toward the massive front doors. I heard Victoria let out a loud, arrogant sigh of relief. I am so sorry, everyone, she announced to her wealthy friends, projecting a fake tone of deep sympathy. My father-in-law's cognitive decline has been so difficult for our family to manage. He gets so confused these days. Please, let us get back to the celebration. The string quartet started playing again. The clinking of glasses resumed. They thought the uncomfortable moment was over. They thought the dirty old man was walking out into the freezing night to sit in his rusty truck and await his absolute ruin. But I did not open the door. I stopped. I stood perfectly still on the marble floor, taking a long, deep breath. The performance was over. The trap had been completely loaded and the prey was standing right in the center of the kill zone. I slowly turned back around. The stooped posture vanished completely. My shoulders squared, my spine straightened. The tired old laborer disappeared into thin air and the ruthless corporate titan who built a logistics empire with his bare hands took full control. I did not walk toward the exit. I turned and walked directly toward the massive dining table in the center of the grand hall, where the enormous holiday feast was laid out. My heavy boots echoed loudly against the marble cutting right through the soft holiday music. Victoria saw me marching back and her face contorted with pure rage. I told you to leave, she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. Security! Get him out of here right now! I ignored her completely. I reached the center of the long dining table, standing right next to the massive roasted turkey and the expensive silver platters. The entire room went dead silent. The music stopped abruptly. Every single eye in the mansion was locked on me. Julian rushed forward, looking panicked. Dad, what are you doing? He demanded, reaching out to grab my arm. Do not touch me! I commanded, my voice booming through the silent room with such absolute terrifying authority that Julian instantly froze and took a step back. I reached into the inside pocket of my faded corduroy jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I did not pull out a legal document. I pulled out a crisp, white sealed envelope. Stamped perfectly in the top left corner was the unmistakable bright blue logo of the National Genetics Laboratory. The envelope was heavy with the weight of a 40-year-old lie. I placed it down flat on the polished mahogany table right next to the crystal wine glasses. I looked up and locked my eyes directly onto Julian's pale, terrified face. The entire room stopped breathing. The ultimate reckoning had finally arrived. The sealed white envelope rested perfectly next to the massive roasted turkey. The bright blue logo of the National Genetics Laboratory stared up at the crystal chandelier above us. The entire grand hall was completely motionless. You could hear the freezing rain beating against the massive glass windows. Over 100 of Atlanta's most elite citizens, politicians, and hedge fund managers were holding their collective breath. They thought they were about to witness the final humiliating surrender of a broken old man. They were entirely wrong. I looked directly at Julian. He was standing a few feet away, his expensive tailored tuxedo looking suddenly tight across his shoulders. His face was a mixture of confusion and lingering arrogance. "You wanted the truth on Thanksgiving, Julian," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with a deep, calm resonance. "You threw a cardboard box in my face in front of your wealthy in-laws. You demanded to know exactly who I was and where I came from. You told everyone at that table that I was hiding a dirty secret." Julian scoffed. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his racist father-in-law Richard, trying to find an anchor for his crumbling confidence. He smirked, taking a step toward the table. "Yeah, I did," Julian replied, trying to sound like the master of the house. "And what is this? Did you finally figure out what slum your ancestors crawled out of? Are you trying to make a scene to distract from the fact that you are losing your mind?" "Today is Christmas, Julian." I continued, completely ignoring his pathetic insults. "And this right here on the table is your gift. Go ahead, open it. Read it out loud for your prestigious guests. Let everyone hear the absolute truth you have been so desperate to uncover." Victoria stepped up next to her husband. She crossed her arms, her red silk gown rustling aggressively. "Just open it, Julian," she hissed impatiently. "Let him embarrass himself, then we can have security throw him out." Julian reached out and picked up the envelope. He broke the seal with a loud tearing sound that echoed in the silent room. He pulled out the crisp official laboratory report. He cleared his throat, puffing out his chest, ready to mock me in front of the entire city. National Genetics Laboratory Official Ancestry and Relation Report. Julian read aloud, his voice dripping with condescending theatricality. Subject: Leroy Sterling. Let us see here. Oh, West African descent. What a massive surprise. He chuckled, looking around the room for laughs, but the crowd remained dead silent. The tension was too thick. They could feel the heavy, dangerous energy radiating from where I stood. "Read the next page, Julian," I commanded softly. The page labeled DNA Matches. Julian rolled his eyes and flipped to the second page. Because he had taken the exact same test months ago to prove his elite pedigree to Victoria's family, his genetic profile was already fully registered in their global database. The algorithm had automatically cross-referenced my sample with his. Julian scanned the top of the page. DNA relative match. He read aloud, his voice still confident. Name: Julian Sterling. He paused. He blinked. His eyes darted back to the beginning of the sentence. He read it again silently. I watched the exact fraction of a second when his entire universe completely shattered. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face as if it had been violently wiped away. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a pale, hollow ghost. His hands began to shake so violently that the crisp white paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what he was reading. "What does it say?" Julian Victoria demanded, her impatience growing. She grabbed his arm, leaning over his shoulder to read the document herself. I watched her perfectly manicured finger trace the bold black letters printed on the page. Then she gasped. It was a sharp choking sound, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of her lungs. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with absolute horror, staring at her husband as if he were a complete stranger. "Read it, Julian." I ordered, my voice dropping to a terrifying absolute zero. "Read it to your wife. Read it to your wealthy in-laws. Read it to the board members standing in this room." Julian slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide with a new, profound terror. He looked at me, his lips trembling. The paper slipped slightly in his hands. "Compatibility." He whispered, his voice so weak and broken it barely reached the front row of guests. 0.00%. No biological relationship detected. A massive collective gasp ripped through the grand foyer. The elite guests stared at Julian with pure, unadulterated shock. Richard and Susan Victoria's arrogant parents froze completely, their jaws practically hitting the marble floor. The man they had welcomed into their family, the man who had bragged about his powerful self-made Sterling bloodline, was not a Sterling at all. Julian dropped the paper onto the mahogany table. He took a staggering step backward, shaking his head frantically in pure denial. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You faked this. You paid someone to print this. You are trying to humiliate me." "I did not fake a single letter on that page, Julian," I replied, stepping closer to him, closing the distance until I was looking down into his terrified, empty eyes. "You ordered the test. You chose the laboratory. You demanded the truth. And the truth is that you do not have a single drop of my blood running through your veins. I stood tall, the weight of 40 years of silence finally lifting off my shoulders. I knew about your mother, Sylvia. I said, my voice echoing with a heavy, profound sadness that quickly hardened into absolute resolve. I knew 40 years ago that she had an affair. I knew from the very beginning that the child she brought into my home was not mine. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain sliding down the glass. Julian was weeping now, large tears rolling down his pale face, completely stripped of his arrogant facade. But I made a choice. I continued, my voice slicing through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. I chose to be a father. I chose to love you. I chose to work 16 hours a day in the blistering heat loading freight trucks until my hands bled just so you could go to private schools and wear expensive suits. I built an empire from the mud, and I handed you the keys to the kingdom out of pure, unconditional love. I pointed my finger directly at his chest. And how did you repay me, Julian? You laughed at me. You let your racist wife treat me like a stray dog. You stole $15 million from my company to pay off her parents' debts. And you tried to lock me in a mental asylum just so you could steal the house I built. You thought you were a mastermind. You thought your elite pedigree gave you the right to trample on the man who gave you a life. Julian fell to his knees right there in the dining room, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table to keep from collapsing completely. Dad, he sobbed, his voice completely broken. Dad, please. I did not know. I swear I did not know. You did not know, I repeated coldly. You are right. You did not know the truth. But you were so confident in your own arrogance that you built a trap specifically designed for your own execution. Julian looked up, his tear-streaked face twisted in utter confusion. What trap? He whimpered, his hands shaking violently against the polished wood. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity for the parasite writhing at my feet. You wanted total control of Sterling Freight, I explained, making sure every wealthy investor and board member in the room heard every single word. You manipulated the board into passing Article 4.2 into the company charter. You legally mandated that the emergency corporate trust and the executive leadership of the entire empire could only be held by an heir who could provide certified medical proof of a direct genetic bloodline to the founder. Julian gasped, the horrifying realization finally hitting his brain like a physical blow. His eyes widened as the absolute magnitude of his colossal mistake crushed him. You thought you were locking me out, I said, my voice cold, unforgiving, and completely final. But I have known the truth for 40 years. You were the one who did not know. And you just shot yourself in the foot, boy. The silence in the grand hall was so absolute you could actually hear the freezing rain lashing against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Over 100 of the wealthiest, most powerful people in Atlanta stood completely frozen, staring at the piece of paper resting next to the roasted turkey. The revelation that the arrogant heir to the Sterling Empire was nothing more than a biological stranger had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Julian was still on his knees, grasping the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as his entire identity shattered into a million pieces. But Victoria was not ready to surrender. Her entire life, her status, her massive ego, and the financial survival of her bankrupt parents depended entirely on the power she thought she possessed through her husband. The initial shock wore off, and a vicious, desperate panic took over. She marched forward, stepping right in front of Julian, shielding him as if she were protecting a fragile investment. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom, her red silk gown rustling loudly. "So what?" she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the marble foyer. "So what if he does not have your blood? Blood does not mean anything in the corporate world, Roy. He is your legally adopted son. He has your last name. You trained him, you groomed him, and most importantly, you legally handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer 3 years ago." She turned to her wealthy guests, raising her chin defiantly, trying to rally the elite crowd back to her side. "He is still the CEO of Sterling Freight," she declared, her voice shaking with desperate arrogance. "He still controls the board. He still controls the assets. A piece of paper from a genetics lab does not erase a legal corporate appointment. You think you can just embarrass us and take back the company because your feelings are hurt. You are just an old, bitter man throwing a tantrum. Julian is still the boss, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." I did not argue with her. I did not even raise my voice to defend myself. I just looked past her toward the heavy oak front doors of the mansion. Right on cue, the massive doors swung wide open, letting a blast of freezing winter wind into the warm, festive foyer. The crowd near the entrance parted instantly, murmuring in confusion as a tall, imposing figure stepped over the threshold. It was Valerie. She wore a razor-sharp midnight blue tailored suit and carried a thick black leather briefcase. Her heels clicked with absolute lethal precision against the imported marble as she walked straight down the center of the room. She did not look at the local politicians. She did not look at the hedge fund managers. She walked directly toward the dining table, her dark eyes locked entirely on Victoria and Julian. Valerie stopped exactly 3 feet away from them. She set her leather briefcase down on the mahogany table right next to the DNA results. "Actually, Victoria," Valerie said, her voice perfectly calm, but carrying the unmistakable weight of an executioner that is factually incorrect. Victoria took a step back, her fake confidence faltering at the sight of my lead counsel. "Who are you?" she demanded, crossing her arms defensively. "You are not on the guest list. Get out of my house." Valerie completely ignored the insult. She snapped open the brass locks of her briefcase and pulled out a thick bound legal document, holding it up for everyone to see. "My name is Valerie, and I am the primary legal counsel for the founder and chairman of Sterling Freight," she announced, making sure her voice projected to every single investor and board member standing in the room. "And I am here to address the current executive structure of the corporation." Valerie turned her gaze down to Julian, who was still kneeling on the floor, his eyes wide with rising panic. "Julian," she continued, her tone absolutely relentless. "3 weeks ago, you called an emergency board meeting. You proposed a series of confidential charter amendments designed to lock your father out of the company and secure your total control over the emergency corporate trust." Julian whimpered, burying his face in his hands. He knew exactly what paper she was holding. "You drafted Article 4.2, Valerie stated, opening the document and reading directly from the highlighted page. "You explicitly mandated that any individual holding executive authority or attempting to access the foundational trust must provide verified, certified medical proof of a direct genetic bloodline to the founder. You wrote that clause yourself, Julian. You pushed it through the board because you believed your DNA was your ultimate weapon." Valerie tossed the corporate charter onto the table, right next to the DNA results. The 2 documents lay side by side, telling the complete, undeniable story of his absolute ruin. "But you forgot to read your own fine print, Julian," Valerie said, leaning over the table. "The clause explicitly states that if the chief executive officer cannot medically prove his direct genetic lineage, all executive powers, voting rights, and claims to inheritance are terminated immediately and irrevocably upon the presentation of contrary evidence." The entire room erupted in shocked whispers. The wealthy elite finally understood the absolute poetic justice of the massacre unfolding in front of them. "You built a legal guillotine to execute your father?" Valerie summarized, her voice ringing with finality. "But you were the one who put your head in the block. By presenting this certified DNA test confirming 0 biological relationship, your father just activated your own amendment. As of this exact second, Julian, you are no longer the chief executive officer of Sterling Freight. You hold 0 shares. You have 0 authority. You have officially legally fired yourself." Victoria let out a horrifying, agonizing shriek. "No," she screamed, grabbing the charter off the table and staring at the legal text as if it were written in a foreign language. "This cannot be real. This is illegal. You tricked him." Julian completely collapsed. His arms gave out, and he fell forward onto the marble floor, weeping openly, uncontrollably in front of the entire Atlanta high society. He crawled toward me, his tailored tuxedo collecting dirt from my boots. He reached out and grabbed my pant legs, sobbing with a pathetic, desperate energy. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking completely. "Dad, I am so sorry. I was stupid. I was greedy." Victoria put the idea in my head. "She told me we needed to secure the legacy. Please, Dad, do not do this to me. We can shred the paper. We can cancel the amendment. Nobody has to know. I am your son. You raised me. We have 40 years of history. Please do not throw me away." I looked down at the boy I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise. I looked at the tears streaming down his face. A decade ago, those tears would have broken my heart. But tonight, they felt like absolutely nothing. The well of my mercy was completely dry. "You threw away our history the exact moment you tried to steal my future, Julian," I said, my voice low, cold, and unyielding. You tried to force me into a mental asylum. You sat in a room and watched your wife call me a dirty laborer. You chose to be a parasite, and now you have to live with the disease you created." I stepped back, prying his trembling hands off my leg. I looked over at Valerie and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. The legal execution was complete. Now it was time for the financial massacre. Valerie pulled a small digital tablet from her briefcase. She tapped the screen a few times, syncing it directly to the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall above the grand fireplace. The screen flickered to life, immediately drawing the attention of every single guest in the room. Victoria wiped her running mascara, looking up at the screen with a brand new sense of dread. "What are you doing now?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "You already took his job. What else could you possibly want?" "I want my money, Victoria," I said, stepping out from behind the table. The massive screen lit up, displaying highly detailed bank statements. The numbers were massive, and the text was highlighted in bright, angry red. "For the past 3 years, I let Julian run the daily operations of my logistics empire," I announced to the crowd, making sure Richard and Susan heard every single word. I trusted him with the company checkbook. But 3 weeks ago, right before he tried to legally erase me from the company, he made a very interesting financial maneuver. I pointed to the screen. The document displayed the massive $15 million commercial mortgage taken out against my 3 largest distribution warehouses. The crowd gasped. The hedge fund managers in the room began whispering aggressively, recognizing the sheer recklessness of the transaction. Julian leveraged the absolute crown jewels of my supply chain to secure $15 million in liquid cash, I explained, my voice echoing off the walls. But he did not use that money to buy new trucks. He did not use it to expand our shipping routes. He used a labyrinth of shell companies and blind trusts to wire every single penny of that money out of the corporate treasury. Valerie tapped the tablet again. The screen shifted, displaying a clear, undeniable flowchart of wire transfers. The arrows all pointed to one single destination account. The name of the receiving company was displayed in massive bold letters: Prestige Holdings. I turned slowly and looked directly at Richard and Susan. Victoria's parents were standing frozen near the Christmas tree, their faces completely drained of blood. Richard was gripping his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Susan looked like she was about to faint, her hands covering her mouth in absolute terror. Prestige Holdings. I continued, my voice slicing through the room like a scythe, is a domestic shell company owned entirely by Richard and Susan. The elite guests physically backed away from Victoria's parents as if they had just been diagnosed with a highly contagious disease. In the high society world, financial fraud and bankruptcy are the ultimate unforgivable sins. Richard and Susan have been secretly bankrupt for years. I revealed, exposing their pathetic illusion to the people they cared about impressing the most. Their estate is leveraged, their credit is maxed, and their shipping company is dead in the water. So Victoria convinced my fake son to rob me blind. They stole $15 million of my hard-earned money just to pay off their personal debts and keep up their fake aristocratic lifestyle. Julian was shaking violently on the floor, his face buried in his hands, completely unable to face the reality of his actions being broadcast to the world. Victoria was hyperventilating, backing away toward the wall. It was a loan, she gasped, her voice high-pitched and frantic. It was just a corporate loan. Julian authorized it as the CEO. It was a bad business deal, but it is not illegal. He was the boss. He had executive immunity. You cannot do anything about it? I let out a low, dark laugh that made the hair on the back of Julian's neck stand up. I walked over to the table and picked up the corporate charter Valerie had brought. That is the beauty of the suicide clause Julian drafted, Victoria, I said, looking right into her panicked eyes. Article 4.2 states that the loss of executive power is retroactive if the individual never actually met the genetic prerequisite to hold the office. I dropped the charter back onto the table with a heavy thud. Because Julian never possessed a single drop of my blood, he was never legally the chief executive officer under his own amended rules. I declared the final absolute truth ringing through the grand hall. Therefore, his signature on that $15 million mortgage was entirely unauthorized. It was not a bad business deal, Victoria. It was not a corporate loan. I looked down at Julian, who was now curling into a fetal position on the marble floor. It was pure, unadulterated embezzlement, I said, my voice cold and final. You have no corporate shield, Julian. You have no executive immunity. You are just a common thief who stole $15 million from Sterling Freight. And tomorrow morning, my lawyers are turning every single piece of this evidence over to the federal authorities. I am taking you to federal court, Julian, and I'm going to make sure you spend the next 10 years of your life sitting in a concrete cell. The echo of my words hung in the grand foyer like a heavy iron weight. Julian was still curled on the cold marble floor, sobbing into his hands, but my attention had already shifted to the true architects of this entire disaster. I looked across the room at Richard and Susan. The high society facade they had maintained for decades had just been violently shattered in front of the very people they spent their entire lives trying to impress. The elite guests of Atlanta were actively stepping away from them, creating a wide circle of isolation around the disgraced couple. In their world, poverty was a disease and financial fraud was the ultimate sin. Richard could not handle the humiliation. The deep red flush of embarrassment on his face quickly mutated into an uncontrollable, violent rage. He pushed past a prominent city councilman and stormed across the marble floor, his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. Susan followed right behind him, her face contorted with panic and fury. She was gripping the fabric of her expensive dress as if she were trying to tear it apart. Richard stopped just a few feet away from me. He was shaking with so much anger that the veins in his neck were visibly bulging against his silk collar. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and unleashed the ugly racist truth he had been hiding behind his polite country club smiles. He called me a deceitful black savage. He yelled that I was a filthy, uneducated laborer who had no right to humiliate a respectable family like his. He screamed that his bloodline was pure and that I was nothing but a lucky street thug who had stolen his way into high society. He told me that he knew judges and politicians. He told me that his family had legal connections that would tie me up in endless litigation until the day I died. He swore that he was going to sue me for defamation, for emotional distress, and for every single penny I had ever earned. He said he would take my mansion, take my company, and leave me to die in the gutter where I belonged. Susan chimed in, her voice shrill and hysterical, echoing loudly in the silent room. She yelled that I was a monster. She said that Victoria was a delicate girl from a distinguished lineage who had been dragged into a fraudulent marriage by my bastard son. She threatened to destroy my reputation in every social circle in the state. They were standing in the center of my house, drinking my wine, and threatening to burn my entire world to the ground. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just stood there looking at them with the cold, absolute indifference of a man inspecting a pile of garbage. They were so blinded by their own unearned sense of superiority that they had completely lost their grip on reality. They were standing on the deck of a sinking ship, screaming at the ocean to stop drowning them. I let them yell. I let them exhaust their lungs and expose their vile bigotry to the entire room. The wealthy guests watched in horrified silence, listening to the true racist nature of the people they had once shared dinner with. When Richard finally ran out of breath and stood there panting with rage, I gave him a slow, chilling smile. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the heavy tension in the air. Valerie stepped forward immediately. She did not say a word. She simply reached into her black leather briefcase and pulled out a third, thick manila folder. She handed it to me with a look of pure predatory satisfaction. This was the folder we had compiled during our late-night shopping spree on Wall Street. I took the folder and tapped it gently against the palm of my hand. I looked straight into Richard's bloodshot eyes. I asked him exactly what he planned to use to sue me. I asked him if he was going to pay his elite lawyers with the empty promises he kept in his bank account. I asked him if he was going to finance this massive legal war using his corporate shipping company. The same shipping company that was currently $30 million in debt and functionally bankrupt. Richard swallowed hard, the color draining slightly from his angry face. He glanced nervously at the surrounding guests, realizing that his financial secrets were being dragged into the brutal light. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of certified financial documents, holding them up for everyone to see. I told Richard that I knew everything about his pathetic illusion. I told the room that his massive suburban estate was leveraged to the maximum limit. I revealed that his country club memberships were months past due and that his luxury cars were on the verge of being repossessed. I told him that the only reason he had not been thrown into federal bankruptcy court 2 years ago was because he was surviving on the stolen money my fake son was funneling into his pockets. Susan gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She looked wildly at her husband, begging him to deny it, but Richard was completely paralyzed. I took a step closer to him, invading his space, forcing him to look up at me. I told him that his biggest mistake was underestimating the old black truck driver. I told him that while he was busy pretending to be a master of the universe, I was busy actually buying the universe. I informed him that 48 hours ago I opened my private anonymous offshore equity fund. I told him that my lawyers went to Wall Street and approached every single investment bank and private equity firm that held his toxic debt. I told him that I offered them a premium they could not refuse and paid for it all in pure liquid cash. I watched the realization hit him. The absolute crushing terror blossomed in his eyes. I told Richard that I had purchased every single penny of his $30 million corporate debt. I told him I bought the mortgage to his sprawling estate. I told him I bought the liens on his luxury vehicles. I told him that I was no longer just the man he despised. I was his supreme creditor. I owned his failing company. I owned the roof over his head. I owned the very bed he slept in. The silence in the grand hall was deafening. The guests were staring at Richard as if he were a walking corpse. He was entirely bankrupt, and he owed his entire miserable existence to the very man he had just called a savage. I delivered the final blow without a single ounce of mercy. I told him that because his corporate accounts were frozen and his payments had bounced, he was officially in severe default. I told him that as the primary debt holder, I was exercising my legal right to liquidate his assets immediately. I announced that tomorrow morning, as soon as the sun came up, my legal team was going to initiate a hostile takeover of his shipping company. I told him the bank was foreclosing on his mansion and that the repo men were coming for his cars. I told him he was completely, entirely, and permanently ruined. The physical impact of my words hit Richard like a speeding freight train. He let out a sharp, choking gasp. His hands flew to his chest, frantically grabbing the fabric of his expensive silk tie. His face turned a terrifying shade of pale gray, and his eyes rolled back into his head. His knees completely buckled beneath him. He collapsed hard onto the polished marble floor, gasping desperately for air. It was a massive, stress-induced heart attack. The sheer weight of his fake empire crushing him all at once was too much for his weak heart to bear. Susan dropped to her knees beside him, screaming hysterically, tearing at her expensive dress as she begged for someone to call an ambulance. The panic in the grand foyer was chaotic but contained. A few of the younger guests pulled out their cell phones to dial emergency services, but nobody rushed forward to administer aid. They were too afraid of being associated with a family that had just been publicly marked for federal fraud and total bankruptcy. Valerie stood silently by my side, her dark eyes watching the pathetic scene on the floor with cold, clinical satisfaction. She quietly slipped the thick manila folder back into her briefcase, locking the brass latches with a sharp, definitive click. That sound was the final nail in the coffin of Richard and Susan's aristocratic facade. They had walked into my home expecting a coronation, and now they were leaving on a stretcher, entirely destitute. I looked over at Victoria, who was standing frozen near the grand staircase, watching her father writhing on the marble floor. Her face was a mask of absolute horror. The realization that she no longer had a wealthy family to fall back on was finally setting in. She had absolutely nowhere to run. The paramedics arrived quickly, pushing through the heavy oak doors of my mansion to tend to Richard, who was still gasping on the cold marble floor. Susan was kneeling beside him, weeping uncontrollably, her expensive makeup completely ruined. You would think that seeing her father collapse from a massive heart attack would shock Victoria into a state of panic or grief. You would think a daughter would rush to her parents' side, holding their hands and begging them to hold on. But Victoria did not move toward her father. She did not even look at him. She stood frozen near the grand staircase, staring blankly at the staggering reality that her entire fake empire had just been burned to the ground. She realized in that exact moment that the endless stream of money was gone. The country club memberships, the luxury vacations, the designer clothes, and the prestigious social standing were all completely obliterated. She was no longer a wealthy heiress. She was the daughter of bankrupt frauds, and she was married to a man who had just been legally stripped of his entire corporate identity. The profound despair on her face did not last long. In the span of a few seconds, it mutated into something incredibly toxic and violent. The mask of the delicate, sophisticated high society woman fell off entirely, revealing the absolute feral greed hiding underneath. Victoria turned her head and locked her eyes on Julian. He was still kneeling on the floor near the dining table, looking like a hollow shell of a human being. She marched toward him, her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble. She did not reach out to comfort her husband. She did not offer him a shoulder to cry on. Instead, she raised her right arm and swung it with all the furious strength she had left in her body. The slap echoed through the massive foyer like a gunshot, cutting right through the sounds of the paramedics shouting instructions. It was so hard and so violent that Julian's head snapped to the side and he stumbled backward, nearly losing his balance on the slick floor. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his pale cheek. He looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes, completely shocked by the physical assault. "You absolutely useless, pathetic bastard," Victoria screamed, her voice tearing through her throat with pure, unhinged malice. "You lied to me. You promised me the world. You told me you were the sole heir to a massive logistics empire. You told me this multi-million-dollar estate was going to be yours. You told me you had the pedigree to lead us into the future." Julian held his trembling hand to his burning cheek, tears streaming down his face. "Victoria, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "I did it all for you. I took that money to give you the life you wanted. I paid your parents' debts so they would accept me. I did it because I love you." "You think I care about your love?" Victoria shrieked, stepping closer and pushing him hard in the chest with both hands. "You think I married you for love? I married you because you were supposed to be a blank check. I endured the whispers from my friends. I convinced my parents to accept you into our family because you promised me a kingdom. You said your father was just an ignorant old laborer who was losing his mind and going to die soon. But you are not an heir, are you? You do not even have his blood. You are just a broke, pathetic criminal playing dress-up with someone else's money." The absolute viciousness of her words hung in the cold air. She had just publicly confessed to the entire transactional nature of their marriage in front of the most elite citizens of Atlanta. She did not love my son. She never had. She tolerated his presence strictly because she thought he held the keys to my vast hidden fortune. And now that the fortune was completely out of reach, she despised him. "I am filing for divorce the second the sun comes up." Victoria spat venomously, turning away from him in absolute disgust. "I will not spend one single night sleeping next to a broke felon. Do not ever speak to me again." Julian fell forward onto his hands and knees. He had lost his company. He had lost his social standing. His entire identity was a lie. And now the wife he had sacrificed everything for, the woman he had betrayed his own father to please, had thrown him away like absolute garbage. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically, looking for any possible lifeline. His desperate, tear-filled eyes finally landed on me. I was still standing tall near the mahogany dining table, the undisputed architect of his complete destruction. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, sliding across the polished marble floor. He reached my boots and reached his hands out, desperately grabbing the fabric of my old gray trousers. He pressed his wet face against my heavy leather work boots, sobbing so hard his entire body shook violently. "Dad," he wailed, his voice unrecognizable, choked with panic and profound regret. "Dad, I am so sorry. Please. I was stupid. I was weak. She manipulated me. She made me feel like I was never enough for her world. Please do not let them send me to prison. Do not throw me out in the cold. You raised me. You taught me how to walk. I am your son. I will do anything. I will scrub the warehouse floors. I will drive the oldest trucks. Just please forgive me. Give me one more chance to be your son." I looked down at the top of his head. For a brief, fleeting second, I saw the ghost of a little boy running through the small apartment we used to share, smiling up at me with pure, innocent joy. I felt a heavy ache in my chest for the child he used to be. But that child was dead. The man clinging to my legs was a treacherous thief who had plotted to steal my home and lock me in a cage. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling hands off my legs. I took a deliberate step backward, severing the physical contact between us completely. Julian looked up at me, his tear-streaked face begging for the unconditional paternal mercy I had given him his entire life. But the well of my mercy was completely dry. "Blood does not make a family, Julian," I said, my voice low, cold, and absolutely final. "Respect makes a family. Loyalty makes a family. I worked my fingers to the bone so you could stand tall in this world, and you chose to get on your knees and crawl for a woman who despises everything about where you come from. You sold your soul to people who mocked our roots. You chose your path. Now you have to walk it completely alone." Julian let out a devastated, agonizing cry, curling into a ball on the floor. He finally understood that there was no safety net left. I was not going to save him. Just as the paramedics were lifting Richard onto a stretcher to wheel him out, the distant wail of heavy sirens pierced the stormy night. The sound was entirely different from the ambulance. It was aggressive and loud, multiplying as several vehicles approached the estate at high speed. The heavy red and blue emergency lights sliced through the darkness outside, painting the falling rain and the massive glass windows of my foyer in harsh neon colors. Several large black utility vehicles screeched to a halt right in front of the grand entrance, blocking the driveway completely. The heavy oak doors swung open again. Sheriff Thomas Hayes stepped inside, shaking the freezing rain off his heavy jacket. He was fully uniformed, carrying the absolute authority of the law. But he was not alone. Right behind him walked 4 tall men wearing dark tactical windbreakers. Across their backs, in bold yellow lettering, was the unmistakable acronym of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The wealthy guests instantly backed away, pressing themselves against the walls of the grand hall. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with federal agents. Thomas walked directly toward the center of the room. He looked at me and gave a short, respectful nod. Then he turned his attention to the miserable people scattered across my floor. Valerie stepped forward, handing a thick stack of legal documents to the lead FBI agent. The agent scanned the papers, his face completely devoid of any emotion. He stepped up to Julian, who was still curled on the marble floor. Julian Sterling, the federal agent, announced, his voice cutting through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. "I hold in my hand a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court. You are hereby being placed under arrest for 3 counts of felony wire fraud across state lines and massive corporate embezzlement. You systematically and illegally transferred $15 million from a corporate treasury into hidden domestic shell accounts." 2 agents reached down, grabbing Julian by the arms and hauling him to his feet. Julian did not fight. He did not argue. When they commanded him to put his hands behind his back, he simply obeyed, submitting to the cold, heavy steel cuffs without a single word of protest. The loud metallic clicking sound echoed off the high ceilings, sealing his absolute ruin. His spirit was completely broken. The lead agent then turned his cold stare toward Victoria. She was standing frozen near the stairs, her face pale with a brand new, profound level of terror. "Victoria Sterling." The agent continued, stepping toward her. "You are being placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit severe wire fraud. Furthermore, you and your parents are being charged with extreme elder abuse conspiracy and attempted medical document forgery." Victoria began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved violently as she shook her head back and forth in pure denial. "What are you talking about?" she screamed, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "I did not forge anything. I did not sign any medical papers. You cannot prove any of this." Sheriff Thomas Hayes reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out my vintage gold pocket watch, holding it up for her to see. "We do not need your signature," Ma'am Thomas said, his voice heavy with disgust. "We have crystal clear audio recordings of you and your husband trapping Mr. Sterling in a locked room. We have you on tape admitting to a conspiracy to forcefully strip him of his assets and commit him to a facility against his will for your own financial gain. The evidence was submitted to a federal judge an hour ago." Victoria let out a horrifying gasp, realizing that the quiet old man she thought she had bullied in that study had actually been recording every single venomous word she spoke. She tried to scramble backward up the stairs, but an FBI agent stepped right behind her, blocking her path. "I am a victim here," she shrieked, thrashing her arms as the agent grabbed her wrists. "My husband lied to me. He told me it was his money. I did not do anything wrong. I am from a good family. You cannot put me in jail. I will not survive in jail." The federal agents did not care about her good family. They forcefully pulled her arms behind her back and snapped the heavy steel handcuffs over her wrists. She kicked and screamed, fighting like a feral animal, but it was completely useless. But the ultimate humiliation for Victoria was yet to come. As the agents dragged her kicking and screaming toward the front doors, passing through the massive crowd of elite guests. Victoria looked to her wealthy friends for help. She looked at the local politicians, the hedge fund managers, and the old money socialites she had worshipped her entire life. She expected them to intervene, to call their expensive lawyers to demand her release. Instead, every single one of them was holding up their glowing smartphones. They were not stepping forward to help her. They were recording her. The bright flashes of camera lights pierced the grand foyer. The wealthy white elites of Atlanta were treating Victoria like a trashy reality television spectacle. She was the arrogant girl who tried to climb to the absolute top of their exclusive circles, and now they were eagerly documenting her spectacular, catastrophic downfall. They looked at her as if she were a piece of garbage being taken out to the curb. She finally understood the harsh, brutal truth. These people never cared about her. They never considered her an equal. She was just entertainment to them, and tonight she was providing the greatest show they had ever seen. The agents shoved her through the front doors out into the freezing rain and toward the waiting armored federal transport vehicles. Julian was marched out right behind her, his head hanging low in absolute shame. The heavy vehicle doors slammed shut, plunging them both into the dark, cold reality of their future. I stood in the center of my silent mansion, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the marble floors, perfectly satisfied that the toxic infection had finally been removed from my life. The freezing rain that had been punishing the city of Atlanta all evening was slowly turning into a heavy, blinding snow. Large white flakes were falling through the harsh neon glare of the red and blue emergency lights blanketing the massive, manicured front lawn of my estate. The federal agents were marching Julian and Victoria down the long, sweeping driveway toward the armored transport vehicles. The cold winter air was biting, but I did not feel it. I walked out through the heavy oak double doors and stood at the edge of my grand marble porch, watching the final consequences of their greed unfold in the snow. Julian was silent. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped forward in his ruined, expensive tuxedo. He was completely defeated, walking like a ghost toward the federal cruiser. But Victoria was a different story entirely. Even with her wrists locked securely behind her back in heavy steel handcuffs, she was fighting every single step of the way. Her red silk gown was dragging through the freezing wet slush, ruining the expensive fabric, but she did not care. The absolute terror of entering a concrete prison cell was fighting a war against her deeply ingrained materialistic arrogance. As the lead FBI agent opened the heavy reinforced rear door of the black utility vehicle, Victoria suddenly dug the heels of her designer shoes deep into the snow, refusing to move another inch. She twisted her body wildly, throwing her weight against the agents holding her arms. "Wait!" she shrieked, her voice echoing violently across the quiet, snow-covered neighborhood. "You cannot just take me like this. Stop pulling me. I need my things. I am not leaving this property without my personal belongings." The federal agent sighed, a puff of white breath escaping his lips in the freezing cold. "Get in the car, ma'am," he commanded, his voice carrying zero patience. "You are under federal arrest. You do not need anything where you are going." But Victoria was entirely unhinged. She looked back toward the massive illuminated windows of my mansion where the wealthy white elite guests were still gathered watching her spectacular downfall. She looked up at the second floor where the sprawling master suite was located. "My closet!" she screamed frantically, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "I have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of designer items up there. I have 6 custom Hermes Birkin bags, I have Chanel dresses, I have the Cartier diamond necklaces Julian bought me for our anniversary. They are mine. They belong to me. Someone go up there and pack my bags right now. I demand my property." She was actually ordering the federal agents to pack her luxury luggage. Even in the face of a decade-long prison sentence, her entire identity was so completely wrapped up in status symbols and expensive leather that she could not fathom leaving them behind. She thought she was still the lady of the house. She thought she still had rights. I took a slow, deliberate step forward on the elevated marble porch. The snow was gathering on the shoulders of my old faded corduroy jacket, but I stood perfectly still, projecting the absolute authority of a king casting out a traitor. "Victoria!" I called out, my voice deep and resonant, cutting right through the howling winter wind. She stopped struggling for a fraction of a second, turning her tear-streaked face to look up at me. "You tell them to get my bags, Roy," she demanded, her tone still dripping with that same toxic entitlement. "You may have tricked Julian out of his company, but you have absolutely no right to keep my personal items. Those bags were gifts. That jewelry belongs to me. If you do not give them to me right now, my lawyers will add grand larceny to the lawsuit." I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of disgust. She was a parasite clinging to the very last drop of stolen blood. I slowly shook my head. "You do not have any personal items, Victoria," I explained, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any pity. "You do not own a single Hermes bag. You do not own a single Cartier necklace. You do not own the silk dress you are wearing right now." "What are you talking about?" she yelled, struggling against the agent's grip. "Julian bought them for me." "Julian did not buy you anything," I corrected her, making sure the elite guest standing in the doorway could hear exactly how her fake lifestyle was funded. "Julian was unemployed today. Julian has been spending my money for the last 3 years. Every single designer bag sitting in that massive closet upstairs, every diamond you wore to your country club dinners, every piece of imported silk you used to impress your racist friends was purchased directly with the $15 million your husband embezzled from the Sterling Freight corporate treasury." Victoria gasped, her eyes darting back and forth as the horrifying reality of corporate asset forfeiture finally began to dawn on her. "They are not gifts, Victoria," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying rumble. "They are stolen goods. They belong to my company. And as of this exact moment, my legal team has officially classified your entire wardrobe as material evidence of federal wire fraud and massive corporate theft." "No," she whimpered, her knees beginning to buckle in the snow. "No, you cannot do this. You are leaving me with nothing." I raised my hand and signaled to the shadows near the grand front doors. My personal head of security, a giant of a man named Marcus, stepped out onto the porch. He was carrying 3 massive, luxurious Louis Vuitton travel trunks. They were the exact custom monogrammed suitcases Victoria had purchased for her trips to Europe. Victoria saw the suitcases and a brief, pathetic glimmer of hope flashed across her face. She actually thought I was showing mercy. She thought I was sending her off with a piece of her fake empire. "Marcus," I said, not taking my eyes off the miserable woman standing in the driveway. "Take out the trash." Marcus walked to the edge of the elevated marble porch. He did not walk down the stairs to hand them over gently. He simply raised his massive arms and hurled the heavy luxury trunks directly off the side of the porch. The expensive leather suitcases flew through the falling snow and crashed violently onto the frozen, manicured lawn. The impact was so hard that the brass latches snapped completely open. The heavy lids flipped back, exposing the interiors to the freezing winter storm. Victoria let out a devastating, agonizing wail. The suitcases were entirely empty. There were no silk dresses. There were no diamond necklaces. There were no designer handbags. Just empty, hollow luxury shells rapidly filling up with freezing, wet snow. "That is exactly what you are, Victoria," I told her, staring down at the empty luggage, a shiny, expensive shell with absolutely nothing of value inside. "You walked into my family with nothing but your arrogant pride and a heart full of greed, and you are walking out of my life with the exact same thing, 2 empty hands and a ruined name." Victoria collapsed, falling to her knees in the freezing slush. She sobbed uncontrollably, the absolute finality of her destruction, crushing whatever was left of her spirit. She had no money. She had no family to bail her out. She had no expensive clothes to pawn for a decent lawyer. She was entirely, completely destitute. The federal agents did not wait any longer. They grabbed her firmly by the arms, pulling her up from the wet ground and shoving her forcefully into the back of the armored transport vehicle. She hit the heavy seat, still weeping wildly. The agent slammed the reinforced steel door shut, cutting off her miserable cries entirely. I looked over at the second vehicle. Julian was already sitting in the back, staring out the thick reinforced glass. He was looking directly at me. His face was pale, his expression entirely hollow. He was leaving the empire he was supposed to inherit, and he was leaving it in handcuffs. I did not wave, I did not nod, I simply held his gaze until the federal agent slammed his door shut as well. The engines roared to life, thick white exhaust billowing into the freezing night air. The heavy vehicles pulled away from the curb, their tires crunching loudly against the fresh snow. I stood on the marble porch watching the flashing red and blue lights disappear down the dark, tree-lined avenue. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, peaceful sound of the falling snow. I looked down at the empty luxury suitcases laying in the frozen grass. The trash had finally been taken out. The infection had been completely removed from my property. I turned around and walked back into the warmth of my massive, quiet mansion, ready to close the door on the past forever. The heavy red and blue emergency lights slowly faded into the distance. They disappeared down the winding, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood. The wail of the sirens was swallowed by the steady, rhythmic sound of the falling snow. For the first time in what felt like an absolute eternity, my property was completely silent. The massive crowd of elite guests had vanished. They scattered like cockroaches the second the federal agents brought out the handcuffs. The toxic infection that had plagued my family had been surgically removed. I stood on the marble porch for a long time, simply breathing in the freezing, damp night air. My chest felt incredibly light. I turned around and walked back through the heavy oak double doors of my mansion. The grand foyer looked like the aftermath of a hurricane. Half-empty crystal champagne flutes were scattered across the silver side tables. Muddy footprints from the frantic exodus of the wealthy guests stained the imported hardwood floors that I had meticulously laid with my own hands decades ago. The air inside the house was thick with the lingering scent of Victoria's expensive, overpowering floral perfume. It smelled like fake sophistication and deeply rooted arrogance. I hated that smell. It was the scent of a woman who had tried to erase my history. I took off my heavy, faded corduroy jacket and draped it over the wooden banister. I slowly rolled up the sleeves of my simple shirt, exposing the thick scars and calluses on my forearms. The billionaire chairman of Sterling Freight retreated into the shadows, and the architect the builder took over. I did not want to wait until the morning to reclaim my space. I wanted the poison out of my house tonight. I picked up my secure phone and made a call to a private 24-hour estate remediation and moving crew that my company kept on a permanent retainer for rapid commercial cleanups. I told the dispatcher I needed a full team of 15 men at my address within the hour, and I needed them to bring the largest industrial disposal trucks they had available. When the crew arrived, I was waiting for them in the center of the massive living room. The foreman, a stout, hard-working man, walked in, brushing snow off his jacket, and asked what needed to be moved to the storage facility. "Nothing goes to storage," I told him, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I want you to go through every single room on the main floor, and the entire top floor. Every piece of modern furniture, every sterile white rug, every piece of abstract art, every single item that my former daughter-in-law brought into this house is to be thrown directly into the garbage trucks. I want this place stripped down to the bare walls and the original hardwood. Do not save a single velvet throw pillow." The foreman nodded, recognizing the absolute finality in my tone. For the next 3 hours, the mansion was filled with the loud, echoing sounds of heavy lifting and dismantling. I watched with profound satisfaction as the cleaning crew hauled away the physical manifestations of Victoria's fake aristocratic empire. They carried out the ridiculous velvet sofas she had bought to impress her country club friends. They dismantled the massive, gaudy, modern dining table where she had sat and mocked my working-class background. They threw her expensive, fragile decorative vases into the heavy steel dumpsters parked in the snow-covered driveway. With every piece of pretentious furniture that went out the front door, I felt the true soul of the house slowly returning. The mansion was finally breathing again. The beautiful exposed brickwork I had crafted, the rich, warm tones of the mahogany walls, the natural flow of the spacious rooms, all of it was suddenly visible once more. Victoria had tried to turn my home into a cold, sterile museum to validate her shallow existence. Now it was just a house again. My house. Once the crew had hauled the last of her pretentious belongings into the dumpsters and the heavy trucks rumbled away into the snowy night, I was left completely alone in the massive empty space. The house was bare, but it felt incredibly warm and solid. I walked down the long hallway to the small ground-floor suite where I had been staying when they tried to push me out of sight. I knelt beside the bed and pulled out a heavy, reinforced steel storage trunk. This was where I had hidden the things that truly mattered to me when Victoria had banished my personal belongings from the main living areas. I unlocked the heavy brass padlock and opened the lid. Inside, resting carefully wrapped in protective soft cloth, was a large silver picture frame. I picked it up, holding it gently in my rough, calloused hands. It was a photograph of my late wife, Sylvia. It was taken 40 years ago, standing in the front yard of our old cramped apartment building right after I had bought my very first used delivery truck. She was wearing simple clothes, smiling so brightly that her joy seemed to leap right out of the glass. I looked at her beautiful face and the heavy weight of the past 40 years settled over me. I knew about her betrayal. I knew about the affair she thought she had kept entirely hidden. I knew that the child she gave me did not share a single drop of my blood. But looking at her picture now, I did not feel any lingering anger or resentment. I had made a promise to her and to the universe to raise that boy as my own. I had given Julian my name, my protection, and my entire empire. I had fulfilled my duty as a father and as a man of honor. The emotional debt I owed to that non-biological child was paid in full. He was the one who chose to burn the bridge. He was the one who chose greed over loyalty. I walked out of the small suite carrying the photograph like a precious relic. I walked through the empty grand foyer and into the main living room. I approached the massive stone fireplace that served as the center of the home. I reached up and carefully placed Sylvia's silver frame right in the middle of the heavy wooden mantelpiece. "I forgive you, Sylvia," I whispered into the quiet room. "The slate is entirely clean. We are finally completely free." I walked over to my private study, closing the heavy mahogany door behind me. The room was perfectly still, illuminated only by the soft glow of the desk lamp. Resting precisely in the center of my large leather writing pad was a thick stack of legal documents that Valerie had prepared for me earlier that week. We had anticipated this exact outcome. We knew that once the corporate guillotine fell, Julian would be entirely stripped of his inheritance. I sat down in my heavy vintage leather armchair, the chair I had bought with my very first massive commercial paycheck over 4 decades ago. It creaked familiarly under my weight, greeting me like an old, loyal friend. I picked up my heavy gold fountain pen and began to read through the final transfer protocols. I was officially and permanently dissolving the generational trust fund established in the name of Julian Sterling. I was liquidating all assets tied to his future inheritance and striking his name from my will entirely. But I was not just leaving the money to sit in a corporate bank account. I turned to the next page of the document. I was taking the entire sum of that massive multi-million-dollar trust fund and establishing a brand new foundational entity. The Leroy Sterling Scholarship Fund. I was creating a massive, fully funded educational and mentorship program right here in the heart of Atlanta. We were going to target young orphaned black men and women, kids who were growing up in the exact same rough, impoverished neighborhoods I came from. Kids who had absolutely nothing but hunger in their bellies and a burning fire in their eyes. I looked around the quiet study, imagining the future generations of strong, brilliant young people who actually deserved a chance. We were going to pay for their college tuitions entirely. We were going to fund their specialized trade schools. We were going to provide zero-interest foundational loans for their very first business ventures. We were going to give them the tools, the education, and the financial bedrock they desperately needed to build their own empires from the ground up. If the boy I raised could not understand the profound value of a hard day of work, then I would pass my legacy on to the children of this city who knew exactly what it meant to survive in the cold. I pressed the gold nib of my pen against the thick parchment paper. I signed my name with a smooth, deliberate flourish, legally transferring the entire fortune to the new foundation. I placed the pen down and leaned back in my chair. The heavy, suffocating burden of the past 3 years was completely gone. The architect had demolished the rotten, treacherous structure, and the ground was finally cleared to build something completely unbreakable. The snow continued to fall gently outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my private study. The violent winter storm that had punished the city of Atlanta all evening had finally settled into a quiet, peaceful rhythm. It was blanketing the sprawling lawns of my estate in a thick layer of pure, untouched white. I sat down heavily in my vintage leather armchair. This was the one piece of furniture in this massive mansion that truly belonged to the man I used to be. The dark brown leather was worn and cracked, carrying the physical memory of thousands of late nights and early mornings. It was the chair I bought with my very first significant commercial paycheck over 4 decades ago. I reached over to the heavy mahogany side table and poured myself a generous measure of aged Kentucky bourbon into a thick crystal glass. The amber liquid glowed warmly in the dim light of the single desk lamp, casting long, slow shadows across the room. I raised the heavy glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The burn was familiar and deeply comforting. It settled right into the center of my chest, melting away the lingering chill of the night and the heavy mental exhaustion of the past 48 hours. I looked around the quiet room, listening to the profound, absolute silence of my home. Many people in this world would look at a 74-year-old man sitting completely alone in a sprawling empty mansion on Christmas Eve and feel a deep, overwhelming sense of pity. They would assume the isolation was a tragic consequence of a broken, stubborn heart. They would think the silence in these large rooms was deafening and sad. But they would be entirely, completely wrong. There is a massive, fundamental difference between being alone and being lonely. For the past 3 years, I had been surrounded by people every single day. My house was filled with the constant arrogant chatter of my son, his vicious wife, and their endless parade of entitled wealthy friends. The rooms were packed with warm bodies, but I had never felt more isolated in my entire life. I was living with parasites. I was sharing my oxygen with people who smiled to my face while actively sharpening the knives they planned to bury in my back. They drained my energy, my resources, and my peace of mind. That kind of company is a suffocating, terrifying prison that slowly kills your soul. But this silence, the absolute stillness I was sitting in right now, was the profound, beautiful loneliness of total freedom. The toxic infection had been completely eradicated from my life. Julian was sitting in a cold concrete federal holding cell downtown, facing a decade behind bars for the massive financial crimes he committed against his own flesh and blood. Victoria, the woman who had tried to erase my existence and throw me into a mental asylum, was locked in a cell right next to him. Her fake empire of designer clothes and stolen prestige had been stripped away forever, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Her arrogant, racist parents, Richard and Susan, were waking up in a hospital room to the horrifying reality of total financial ruin. I had legally purchased their debt, foreclosed on their estate, and liquidated their failing company. The people who thought they could manipulate and destroy the old black truck driver were entirely, completely erased from my world. The truth is often incredibly brutal. When Julian threw that genetic testing kit onto my dining table on Thanksgiving, he thought he was pulling a clever, cruel prank to humiliate an old man in front of high society. He thought he was exposing my past. He thought he was proving his superiority. Instead, he handed me the exact surgical scalpel I needed to cut out the necrotic tumors that were killing my family tree. A scalpel cuts deep and it causes bleeding, but it is the only way to remove the rot and save the healthy tissue. The truth hurts, but it is always necessary. It slices away the lies, the manipulation, and the fake smiles, exposing the raw, ugly reality underneath. I had known for 40 years that the boy I raised was not my biological son. I had chosen to love him anyway, to give him my name and my empire. But unconditional love cannot cure fundamental greed. It cannot fix a rotten character. I leaned my head back against the cool leather of my armchair, closing my tired eyes. A wave of profound, absolute satisfaction washed over my entire body. It started deep in my chest and radiated out to my fingertips. It was the exact feeling of a king reclaiming his throne after casting out the treacherous thieves who tried to steal his crown. My dignity, which Victoria had tried to strip away piece by piece, had been fully restored. I was no longer the quiet old man pretending to be fragile in the background. I was Leroy Sterling, the architect, the titan, the undisputed master of my own universe. I had built this empire from the mud of the slums, and I had just protected it from the vultures. The morning sun slowly began to rise over the snowy Atlanta skyline, pouring bright golden light through the tall windows of my study. The light illuminated the signed legal documents resting perfectly in the center of my desk. The Leroy Sterling Scholarship Fund was officially established. The millions of dollars I had pulled back from Julian's frozen corporate accounts were already being processed by my legal team. In a few short months, this massive, empty house would not be filled with arrogant country club elites sipping stolen champagne. It would be filled with young, ambitious black men and women from the hardest neighborhoods in the city. Kids who knew the profound value of a hard day of physical work. Kids who understood loyalty because they had to rely on it to survive. Kids who just needed one solid piece of foundation to build their own towering empires. They would be my true legacy. I would look into their hungry eyes and see myself 50 years ago. They would carry the Sterling name with the honor, the strength, and the dignity it truly deserved. I stood up from my leather chair, leaving the empty crystal glass on the desk. I walked over to the tall window and looked out at the pristine, untouched snow covering my estate. The violent storm had washed away the dirt, the mud, and the toxic residue of the people who had tried to bury me. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet taste of absolute victory and unshakable peace. Blood is merely biology, but character is a choice. When you sacrifice your entire life to build an empire, never let entitlement blind those who inherit your sweat. True power is not displayed through loud arrogance. It is hidden in absolute terrifying silence. When toxic people hand you the weapon to destroy them, do not get angry, simply wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. Respect is the only currency that matters. Cut the parasites loose, reclaim your peace, and remember a king never negotiates with thieves who try to steal his throne. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace and your dignity, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of justice and truth. Stay strong and always protect your empire.